Hello, my friend. Tonight, I'm going to take you on a journey into one of the most thrilling and forbidden chapters of history, a story that will truly leave you speechless. Just imagine the city you live in today. If 1 out of every 15 women had to sell her body just to survive, how would that feel? Unbelievable, right? But this is not a story. I'm talking about the ancient city of Rome, where nearly 45,000 women were involved in the world's oldest profession. But the most surprising part is, this dark world was not filled with helpless women alone. Many of them lived such luxurious lives that even today's biggest celebrities would pale in comparison. And some women fell into such deep despair that death became their only escape. So tonight, I will take you back 2,000 years into the hidden pages of the Roman Empire. I will tell you those untold stories, the ones you may have never heard before. But before we begin, just a small request. If you enjoy my history-based work, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like on the video, and comment where you're watching from. I will definitely reply to your comment. Now, dim the lights, turn down the fan, lie down comfortably, close your eyes, because I'm about to bring before you one of the most unbelievable chapters in human history, alive and vivid. Let's begin. A morning in darkness. You wake up, but you are not fully awake. Your sleep is never complete. Water drops from the corner of the ceiling. The floor has stains everywhere. The air feels heavy. It smells of smoke, sweat, and sadness. You touch the wooden wall beside you. That is how you know the day has started. Here, sound tells you morning has come, not light. You live under the city of Rome. Your room is small and hidden. No one could ever find it on a map. This is your home. This is your work. This is your only address. Above you, people in the tavern are still asleep. You sit below, waiting for your day to begin. The room is so small that even your shadow waits outside. Your bed is made of old straw and dirty cloth. You are not alone there. There are insects, rats, dust, and tiredness. The smell of wine-soaked cloth never leaves. It feels like a strange kind of comfort. Beside you, a small oil lamp burns weakly. When the oil runs out, the flame shakes like your mood. In the corner, there is a clay bowl. It holds not water, but the tired air of yesterday. Next to it is a bucket. You try not to think about it. All your things are in one small basket. A cracked mirror, some dry paint, a wooden comb. They are worth nothing, but they are everything you need for your work. There is no running water here. No toilet. Bathing is a rare luxury. Maybe there is a bathhouse nearby. People share the same water again and again, and the awkward stairs are always free. You sit in front of your bronze mirror. The light is dim. You still know your face. It is tired, but ready to fight another day. You put powder on your face. You add red to your cheeks. You use perfume until the air itself smells heavy. Anyone who opens the door will know you are ready. You do not wear it to smell good. You wear it to smell less bad than the people around you. You practice your smile. It feels fake, but you do it anyway. It is the same smile you wear every day. Rome has walls, but no privacy. Doors exist, but they stop nothing. You know someone will come soon, a knock on the door, a voice calling you. You will have to do whatever they want. This room is your office. Your life is your business. Roman men fight their wars outside. You fight yours here, in silence. You know the city will never remember you. No statue will carry your name. No poem will be written for you. But behind every ancient coin and behind every royal feast, there is the quiet breath of women like you. Imagine walking through the narrow streets of ancient Rome. The air smells of baked bread, sweat, and cheap wine. Behind the noise of the markets and the echo of sandals on stone, there were doors that stay half closed. Behind those doors lived women whose stories were rarely written down, the prostitutes of Rome. For most of them, this life was not a dream. It was a decision made out of hunger, debt, or survival. Some were slaves sold into brothels by their masters. Others were freed women who had no family, no dowry, and no trade to survive on. Rome was a city of luxury, but it was also a city of poverty. When every coin mattered, selling one's body became a profession, not a secret. Prostitution in ancient Rome was legal. The government taxed it. The law required prostitutes to register with the local aedile, the official who handled moral order. Once registered, a woman could not easily leave the trade. Her name stayed in the records. That meant, even if she tried to start a new life later, society would still know her as a meretrix, a prostitute. Respectable Roman citizens would never marry her. Freedom had limits. Most women entered the trade young. Some were born into slavery and never knew another path. A few came from fallen families, forced by debt or betrayal. There were even stories of women who joined the profession by choice, seeking wealth or adventure. But those were rare. For most, the choice was survival. A typical prostitute in Rome worked in what was called a lupanar, a brothel. The word comes from lupa, meaning she-wolf, a term Romans used for prostitutes. These brothels were everywhere, near taverns, beside bathhouses, behind markets, even under the shadow of temples. Pompeii alone had dozens. Some were large, with painted walls and stone beds. Others were dark rooms, no bigger than a cupboard. Inside a lupanar, space was tight. The rooms were barely wide enough for a bed. Light came from oil lamps that smoked and flickered. The walls were often covered with graffiti, prices, names, drawings of lovers, or messages from satisfied customers. Privacy did not exist. You could hear every word, every sound through the thin walls. The day began early. A woman would wake in her small cell, wash her face with a bit of water, and prepare for the first customers. There was no luxury of mirrors or perfumes. She used cheap powders, sometimes made from chalk or ashes. Her clothes were simple but revealing. Dyed tunics, often yellow, the color associated with prostitution. The law even required prostitutes to wear certain styles so they could be easily recognized. By mid-morning, the first clients arrived. Soldiers on leave, merchants, travelers, even young men of noble birth who wanted what they could not get at home. For many men, visiting a brothel was as normal as going to the baths. In a society that worshipped virility, male desire was considered natural and acceptable. The shame fell on the woman, not the man. Prices varied widely. A cheap session in Pompeii could cost as little as 2 asses, the price of a loaf of bread. Higher status courtesans, educated women who could play music, quote poetry, or host dinners, could charge several denarii, enough to feed a family for days. Most prostitutes fell somewhere in between. On a busy day, a working girl might see 10 to 20 clients. Others, in the rougher parts of the city, might see even more.
But not all the money was theirs. Many were owned by a lino, or madam, who took most of the profit. If a prostitute was a slave, every coin went to her master. A few lucky ones managed to save enough to buy freedom, but that was rare. The average lifespan in the trade was short, often cut by disease, violence, or exhaustion. Despite the harshness, brothels were part of Rome's daily rhythm. They stood next to bakeries, wine shops, and bathhouses. In the evenings, music and laughter spilled from their doors. Men would toss coins, drink cheap wine, and disappear inside. The city pretended not to notice, yet everyone knew. Even senators and soldiers wrote jokes about prostitutes. They were everywhere, and yet invisible. Some prostitutes tried to stand out, painting their hair red or gold, wearing jewelry, giving themselves new names. Names like Flora, Cyprus, or Lupa were common, borrowed from goddesses of love and fertility. They hoped that by taking on these names, they might feel a little more powerful, even if only in fantasy. For others, there was no illusion. The nights were long, the air heavy, and the work unending. Many slept on straw, surrounded by the smell of sweat and oil. In winter, the rooms were freezing. In summer, suffocating. Still, they smiled when the next client entered, because each visit meant another meal, another day alive. Historically, prostitution in Rome was a paradox. It was both condemned and protected, despised and necessary. The empire built temples to Venus, the goddess of love, while also shaming the women who served men's desires. The state collected taxes from them, but denied them dignity. They were part of the city's foundation, yet never part of its glory. At nightfall, when the last lamps burned low and the streets grew quiet, these women lay back on their straw beds. Maybe they thought of another life, one with a home, a husband, a name unmarked by shame. Or maybe they didn't think at all. In a world that valued pleasure more than compassion, dreams were a dangerous luxury. Still, their presence shaped Roman society. They taught the empire what it meant to buy and sell desire, to turn survival into a service. Their work funded taverns, bathhouses, and taxes that kept the city running. And though history tried to erase their names, the ruins of Pompeii still whisper their stories, carved into stone, preserved by time.
The morning in Rome began long before the sun touched the marble rooftops. Down in the shadows, beneath taverns and bakeries, another world woke. A world that smelled of oil, dust, and cheap perfume. She opened her eyes before dawn. The air was cold, heavy with the stench of smoke and sweat. From above she could hear footsteps, the barkeeper preparing wine, a drunk still snoring. Her bed was nothing more than straw spread over stone, but it was warm enough to keep her alive. She sat up slowly, rubbing her arms to chase away the chill. The city outside was still half asleep, but for her, the day had already begun. There was no time for dreaming. Every hour was worth money, and every delay meant hunger. She reached for the small bronze mirror on the wall. It was cracked and foggy, but it reflected just enough. Her face was pale, marked by sleeplessness. She ran her fingers through her hair, tangled, smelling faintly of oil. From a small box, she took a pinch of chalk powder and brushed it on her cheeks. It wasn't beauty she was creating. It was armor. Outside, the sound of carts and shouts began to rise, the rhythm of Rome waking up. She listened for a while, then stood. Her tunic was yellow, faded from years of washing in dirty water. The color was required by law. It marked her as what she was. No Roman matron would ever wear it. She tied the cloth around her waist, added a cheap copper bracelet, and dabbed her neck with perfume made of vinegar and herbs.
The first knock came not long after. It was always the same sound, short, uncertain, like guilt pretending to be casual. She opened the door to find a young soldier, still wearing half his armor. He avoided her eyes. They never looked at her face. He placed a coin in her palm, 2 asses, maybe 3, and stepped inside. There were no words, just the rustle of cloth and the creak of the straw bed. When it was over, he left as silently as he came. She counted the coin, dropped it into a small clay bowl, and wiped the sweat from her neck. There would be more before noon. Her stomach growled. From the alley outside, a bread seller shouted the day's prices. She stepped out into the light, shielding her eyes. The sun was climbing over the rooftops, painting the city gold. The streets were alive now. Bakers, traders, water carriers, and beggars. The smell of fresh bread mixed with the stink of the open drains. Rome was beautiful and rotten at once. She bought a small piece of bread and a cup of watered wine. That was breakfast. Standing by the wall, she chewed slowly, watching the crowd. Nobody looked at her. Nobody ever did. For them, she was a shadow, a necessary stain on the city's perfection. By midday, the heat grew thick. The stone walls of the brothel trapped the warmth, turning the air into steam. Her hair stuck to her neck. More men came, merchants this time, laughing too loud, smelling of fish and garlic. They always acted powerful, but once the door closed, they all wanted the same thing: to be held, to be seen, even for a moment. Some talked, some cried, some said nothing at all. She listened, because listening was part of the job. She had learned long ago that silence could be more valuable than words. Between clients, she cleaned the bed, splashed her face with stale water, and rubbed oil on her arms to hide the smell. The walls of her room were covered with drawings, crude hearts, names, symbols of luck. A few were made by her own hand, small reminders that she still existed. By afternoon, she was tired. Her body ached, her voice was hoarse. Sometimes she thought of the past, of the village she came from, the brother who sold her, the promise of freedom that never came. But such thoughts were dangerous. In this world, memory was a luxury she could not afford. As the sun began to fall, the noise outside grew softer. The rich prepared for their banquets. Music drifted from nearby taverns. Inside, she waited for the last men of the night. Older, quieter, their hands trembling. They came with heavy breath and heavier hearts. For them, she was a comfort. For her, they were another coin in the bowl. When the door finally closed for the last time, the city had gone dark. She sat by the small oil lamp, watching the flame dance. Her skin smelled of sweat and cheap perfume. Her fingers traced the edge of a bronze coin. The day's earnings. Enough for bread, maybe for a new tunic next week. Sometimes she imagined leaving. She had heard stories of women who saved enough to buy freedom, who opened small taverns or laundries, but she also knew most of them never made it. The city swallowed dreams faster than it granted them. She lay back on her straw bed. The lamp flickered, then went out. The darkness was thick, but she no longer feared it. Darkness was honest. It hid what daylight always revealed. Outside, Rome continued. The carriages, the laughter, the prayers to distant gods. No one thought of the women in the shadows, yet without them, the city's heartbeat would have been slower, weaker. Tomorrow she would wake before dawn again, The same sounds, the same faces, the same silent routine. But for now, she allowed herself one small, dangerous thing: hope. Maybe one day, she thought, someone will remember that we lived here too.
In the city of Rome, everyone had a role. Some fought wars in distant lands, some counted coins in crowded markets, and some lived in the shadows, unseen yet always present. The prostitutes of Rome walked that line between necessity and stigma, desire and regulation, pleasure and law. Roman society had long accepted prostitution, but acceptance did not mean respect. Women in this trade were legal, taxed, and registered. A prostitute was known as a meretrix, a word both descriptive and damning. The term marked her body as public property, even if her mind and soul remained private. Citizens, politicians, and priests all recognized their presence, yet no respectable matron would step into their rooms. The law demanded that prostitutes be registered with aediles, officials charged with moral oversight. Each woman's name, sometimes her age and status, was entered in public records. Slaves became their master's property in paper and in life. Freed women kept part of their earnings but remained labeled. In effect, the state treated these women as necessary but not worthy of equality. A meretrix could be taxed, summoned, punished, but never fully defended. Rome's morality was paradoxical. Men could buy sexual services without shame. A senator could have a wife and yet frequent the brothel at night. Soldiers, merchants, even philosophers and poets indulged in this trade openly. Yet the women who received their coins bore all the social consequences. Their reputation could not be repaired. Graffiti on walls, lewd jokes, and poems preserved their public shame more than their private skills. Punishments were real and often brutal. A prostitute who broke the law, such as hiding earnings, refusing clients, or entering forbidden areas, risked flogging, imprisonment, or public humiliation. The city watched for transgressions carefully. Yet enforcement was uneven. A woman's protection often depended on the brothel owner's influence or the connections she could quietly cultivate. Some women occupied higher social ranks within this underground world. Courtesans with education, charm, and poise could navigate the courtly circles. They knew poetry, music, and etiquette, and some even influenced senators' decisions indirectly. These women were exceptions, but their existence demonstrated that skill, wit, and beauty could temporarily elevate a life otherwise confined by law and poverty. Daily life, however, remained grueling for most. Streets were busy, clients were impatient. A knock on the door could arrive at any hour. Patrons varied from the curious young to the demanding and dangerous older men. Each interaction required careful negotiation, a smile, a gesture, an attentive ear. Pleasures were given, but so too was labor, a constant performance under the watchful eyes of society. Brothels were marked clearly in many districts. Signs, symbols, and the color of tunics identified the women and their services. Wealthy patrons might pay extra for privacy, for rooms with softer beds, for perfume, for attentive conversation. But even in the smallest cells, rules were strict. Silence in the halls, adherence to schedules, and proper registration were enforced with penalties. Despite the legal recognition, prostitutes were socially invisible. Public festivals, religious rites, and civic ceremonies ignored them. The city's wealth and joy depended on their work, yet they were excluded from social honor. When a client flaunted his coin, the city's morals remained intact. The moral burden fell entirely on the woman. The paradox extended into religion. Temples to Venus, the goddess of love, reminded citizens that pleasure was divine. Yet mortal women who sold that pleasure were considered impure. They prayed in private, often hoping the goddess would protect them from illness, betrayal, or violence. The same hands that carried coins for the god's blessing also judged them harshly in society. Clients also shaped morality. Some came out of desire, others out of desperation. A few sought companionship, an ear to hear their woes. Many others treated women as objects, fleeting satisfactions, or symbols of conquest. These encounters demanded not only bodily service, but emotional labor. A prostitute might listen to a merchant's fears, laugh at a young soldier's awkward jokes, or feign interest in a senator's stories. She was both a mirror and a mask, reflecting the city's desires while hiding her own. The tension between law and life, between morality and desire, made survival an art. Each day required calculation, which client to accept, which rules to obey, which opportunities to seize. Earnings could be modest or extraordinary. A single lucky coin might mean food for days, while another client might demand patience, skill, or risk. Through it all, women learned resilience, cunning, and an instinct for survival. Nightfall did not bring relief. The city's watchmen patrolled, but shadows were long and dangers persisted. Rivalries, jealousies, and the threat of violence loomed constantly. Brothel owners, sometimes protective, sometimes exploitative, kept women in line. Every decision carried consequences. In a society that demanded pleasure but punished its providers, living required vigilance. By the end of a long day, a prostitute would return to her small cell, counting coins, brushing dirt from her tunic, and washing off the traces of 1,000 hands. She was invisible again in the darkness, but her presence had made the city thrive. She had walked the fine line between desire and law, morality and survival, earning what society allowed but rarely respected. Her story, repeated in thousands of rooms across Rome, reveals a society reliant on those it despised. Ancient laws, social judgment, and divine paradox shaped a life both precarious and vital. Every coin, every client, every whispered interaction was part of the fabric that held Rome together. Unseen, undervalued, but essential. In the quiet of her room, she could feel the pulse of the city. Every laughter from the taverns, every coin clinked in the bowls, every word of gossip reflected her existence. She was part of the empire, yet apart from it. She survived, endured, and persisted. And through her eyes, we can glimpse the fragile balance of desire, law, and morality that defined the heart of Rome.
The brothel, the customers, and the daily grind. The brothel opened its doors with the rising sun, though the city itself might still be wrapped in early morning mist. Inside, the air was warm, heavy, and faintly sweet with perfume. Every room smelled of wax, oil, and the faint residue of previous visitors. Here, life unfolded in a rhythms dictated by coins, knocks on doors, and whispered instructions from the madam or the brothel keeper. Women emerged from their small cells. Some stretched stiff arms, tired from a night of guests. Some shuffled to the basin for a quick splash of water. Their tunics, always the same shade of yellow, marked them unmistakably. Hair was combed, sometimes scented with oils made of flowers or herbs. Lip color, eye darkened with soot or coal, a faint shimmer of powder. These were tools of survival, signals to the men who would soon arrive. Clients varied day to day. There were the young men, nervous, inexperienced, fumbling with coins as if each was a treasure. There were soldiers, rough and confident, testing boundaries, eager for release. Merchants and travelers brought the world with them, the smell of faraway spices, the sound of languages not often heard in Rome. Even politicians and senators sometimes appeared, their presence formal, almost clinical, yet always transactional. For each visitor, a woman performed a delicate balance of roles. She was companion, entertainer, listener, and pleasure provider. She laughed at jokes she didn't find funny, nodded at complaints she could not care about, and mirrored desires she might secretly fear. Every gesture, every glance, every sigh had a purpose. Survival demanded this choreography. The pace never slowed. Some women saw only a few clients, others dozens. In busy neighborhoods near taverns and baths, the rhythm was relentless. Each session had to be timed, each coin counted, each rule observed. A misstep could provoke anger or a loss of future clients. In a society where reputation, even within the brothel, mattered, mistakes were expensive. Meals were quick and modest. A crust of bread, a sip of watered wine, maybe a piece of cheese. There was little time for leisure, and privacy was impossible. Conversations between women were whispered, short, protective. Advice was shared cautiously. Which client could be trusted, which rooms were cold, which visitors might be dangerous. Brotherhood among women was fragile, built on mutual survival rather than trust. The physical toll was undeniable. Hours standing, bending, performing, speaking, laughing, and sometimes fighting off unwanted advances wore the body. Fatigue settled into muscles, back, and feet. Yet even in exhaustion, a woman had to maintain poise. Her value depended on appearance as much as skill. She touched, comforted, and performed for coins, but she also guarded herself against bruises, cuts, and illness. Emotionally, the strain was heavy. Many carried memories of family lost, debts unpaid, or freedom denied. Every client reminded her of her situation. Some offered kindness, fleeting smiles, small words of empathy. Others were cruel, careless, or demanding. To endure, she learned to separate her heart from her work. Compartmentalization became a survival skill, a protective armor of the mind when the body could not rest. Between visitors, women cleaned their spaces. Straw beds were shaken out, floors swept, lamps refilled. Fresh sheets were a luxury. Sometimes old linens were washed quickly and reused. Mirrors were polished, clothes adjusted, hair combed again. These rituals, small and precise, maintained dignity in a profession that society tried to strip away from them. Occasionally, women would have moments to themselves, a short nap, a whispered story, a stolen bread crust eaten quietly. Even these small acts were precious, reminders that life existed beyond the brothel walls, if only for a few minutes. As dusk approached, the flow of clients changed. Afternoon merchants left, soldiers returned to barracks, travelers headed to inns. Evening brought a new set of men, wealthy, cautious, seeking the safety and secrecy of the brothel. Here, women might have a moment to use their wit and charm more fully, negotiating extra coins, a private room, or small favors. It was a subtle game of power, measured carefully with each gesture. Night deepened, and so did exhaustion. By the late hours, rooms emptied slowly. Women counted their earnings, tucked away coins into hidden pouches or small boxes, noting which clients would return. Lamps burned low,
Shadows danced on walls, and silence finally filled the spaces that had been alive with voices, laughter, and sighs all day. When the doors finally closed, the women collapsed on their straw beds. Their bodies ached, and their minds were heavy with thoughts unspoken. Outside, Rome continued its endless rhythm. But inside the brothel, life paused briefly, a temporary respite before the next day demanded repetition. In these rooms, the true daily grind of a Roman prostitute unfolded. It was a life of precision, endurance, and constant vigilance, a blend of physical labor, emotional labor, and strategic survival. Every coin, every laugh, every nod of acknowledgement was part of the machinery that kept them alive, fed, and sometimes dreamily hopeful. Even as the city celebrated grandeur, erected temples, and praised gods, the women in the brothels kept its unseen heartbeat. Without them, the markets would move slower, the taverns quieter, and the lawless streets less alive. Their labor, though invisible to most, was essential to the city's economy, rhythm, and culture. Rome thrived on desire, yet punished its providers. Pleasure existed in the light, but the women who delivered it lived mostly in shadow. Their lives were a testament to resilience, endurance, and the silent artistry of survival. And through each day, repeated endlessly, they carved a history of quiet significance into the stones of the city.
Health, hygiene, and the risks of life in the brothel. In the narrow, dimly lit rooms of Roman brothels, health was always a fragile illusion. Life in these cramped quarters demanded endurance, but it also invited danger from disease, exhaustion, and the constant physical demands of the trade. For the women who lived there, hygiene was both a survival tool and a daily ritual, performed against odds that modern observers could scarcely imagine. Water was scarce. There were no private baths, no running faucets, no modern plumbing. Instead, women relied on basins, public fountains, and the occasional bathhouse. Even when visiting the communal baths, the water was shared, often murky, and certainly used by dozens before them. A splash on the face or hands could refresh, but it could not cleanse the reality of exposure. To combat body odor and maintain some semblance of cleanliness, women turned to natron, a mixture of salt and soda. It exfoliated skin, reduced smells, and gave a temporary sense of freshness. Oils were applied to hair and skin to make them appear glossy and soft, but these same oils could harbor bacteria if not carefully managed. Hygiene was a balancing act between beauty, health, and necessity. Illness was common. Respiratory infections spread easily in rooms crowded with people, and poor nutrition weakened the immune system. Fevers, coughs, and skin rashes were everyday risks. A woman who fell ill could miss work for days, losing precious coins and favor with her clients. Worse, some diseases were sexually transmitted, invisible dangers that could ruin her health, fertility, and reputation. Without modern medicine, remedies were rudimentary: herbal washes, poultices, or prayers to Venus or other protective deities. In addition to illness, physical injuries were a constant concern. Long hours standing or performing left backs and feet sore. Rough handling from clients could leave bruises or worse. Some women learned to navigate these dangers through skill and intuition, knowing when to resist, when to yield, and when to demand payment for risks endured. Survival depended as much on judgment as on endurance. Mental health, though unrecorded formally, was under constant strain. Emotional labor, smiling, comforting, listening, was relentless. Nights alone offered brief respite, but the weight of social stigma and the stress of performance could not be fully escaped. Many women turned to brief pleasures, small meals,
whispered stories with friends, or stolen laughter as coping mechanisms. Cosmetic practices were intimately tied to health. Powders and rouges might hide fatigue and blemishes, but they also protected against sunlight and minor skin irritations. Perfumes masked odors, but some contained substances harmful in the long term. Still, appearance was currency. A woman who looked unkempt risked losing clients, and with them, her daily earnings. Every application of powder, every brush of oil was part of a careful dance between necessity and self-preservation. Diet was sparse. Bread, watered wine, and occasional cheese or vegetables were common. Nutritional deficiency left women vulnerable to disease and fatigue. Yet with careful planning, coins earned in the morning could secure slightly better food in the evening, a luxury, but one that mattered in a body under constant strain. The social structure of the brothel also influenced health. Senior women often guided novices, teaching which clients were safer, how to handle certain behaviors, and which rooms were less prone to drafts or insects. Advice about sleeping arrangements, shared utensils, and bathing routines helped prevent some illness. In a world without formal health care, communal knowledge was a critical lifeline. Despite precautions, the dangers remained. Many women faced life-threatening conditions, whether from violent clients, accidents, or rampant disease. A single misstep could mean injury or the loss of livelihood. Yet remarkably, women adapted. They became adept at reading people, timing routines, and maintaining their strength despite exhaustion. Even hygiene itself was political and economic. A woman who managed to appear clean, fragrant, and healthy attracted more clients and earned more coins. Those who could not maintain these appearances risked falling into poverty, forced to take greater risks or endure harsher conditions. Hygiene, then, was not merely a personal choice. It was intertwined with survival, income, and social standing. The city outside seemed indifferent. Markets, forums, and temples thrived, while the women inside brothels struggled with health risks invisible to the public eye. Yet these women formed a backbone for the economy, their labor circulating wealth, enabling trade and maintaining societal norms around pleasure and desire. Their resilience was quiet but essential. Night in the brothel was both a time of work and a reminder of risk. Exhaustion blended with vigilance. Each client brought the possibility of illness or injury. Each day, the body accumulated fatigue that would only partially dissipate with a few hours of rest. Women learned to listen to their own bodies, to pace themselves, and to rely on skills honed through experience. Ultimately, life in the brothel was a complex negotiation. Women balanced appearance, cleanliness, and health against danger, fatigue, and the judgment of a society that used their labor but denied them respect. Every choice, when to bathe, how much powder to apply, what food to eat, was influenced by survival, income, and safety. In the shadows of Rome, these women maintained their health as best they could, preserving dignity in a world eager to strip it away. Their bodies bore the physical cost, their spirits the emotional strain, yet they endured. Through careful attention to hygiene, clever use of cosmetics, and knowledge passed among themselves, they survived the dangers of disease, overwork, and social scorn. Even in their invisibility, these women left traces. The stones of Pompeii, graffiti on walls, and the records of taxes hint at a world where health and hygiene were both weapon and shield, where survival required strategy, and where the smallest measures could mean the difference between life and death. In the dimly lit brothel, each brush of oil, each careful application of powder, each cautious gesture reflected a profound understanding of the precarious balance between pleasure, law, and health.
Cycles of life, menstruation, pregnancy, and hygiene in the brothel. Life in the brothel was never simple. Beyond the constant rhythm of clients, coins, and survival, Roman prostitutes faced the biological realities of their bodies. Menstruation, pregnancy, and the daily rituals of hygiene were challenges that required ingenuity, courage, and careful planning. Menstrual hygiene was a private and delicate matter, yet it had to coexist with the public nature of their work. Women fashioned absorbent cloths from rags, carefully folded and tied. Some were washed in cold water and reused. Others were discarded, a risk taken only when coins permitted. There was no modern toilet, no sanitary products. The nearest latrine might be a public facility, filled with other people, often dirty and smelly. Each visit demanded both discretion and speed. Pregnancy brought its own trials. The city's laws did not protect prostitutes, and a pregnancy could threaten income, social standing, and even personal safety. Many women sought abortions using herbs or rudimentary techniques, dangerous and often ineffective. Others continued, hoping to earn enough to survive until birth. A pregnant woman had to navigate her work carefully, balancing her health, the growing child, and the demands of clients. Some brothel owners might allow a temporary respite. Most expected work to continue. Daily hygiene was as much about survival as about dignity. Without running water, women used basins, buckets, and public fountains. Soap was rare, but substances like natron and scented oils helped cleanse the body. Hands, faces, and feet required constant attention. Infections could be debilitating. Even small injuries left untreated could mean days of lost income. Hair and skin were carefully maintained, despite the heat, dust, and sweat that permeated every room. Toilets were communal at best, and often unsanitary. The women learned to adapt, timing visits to avoid crowds, and maintaining personal rituals to reduce disease. Even small acts like pouring water over hands before and after use were strategic. Cleanliness was not only a matter of comfort, it was protection. A urinary infection, a skin rash, or a minor illness could quickly escalate, reducing earnings and risking social consequences. Pregnancy required special measures. The body demanded rest, nutrition, and gentleness, luxuries rarely afforded, yet some women managed by pacing their work, eating more when possible, and relying on the solidarity of other women for support. In certain brothels, older or more experienced women would offer advice on positioning, labor signs, and remedies for discomfort. Social bonds, though fragile, could mean the difference between survival and disaster. The cycle of menstruation, pregnancy, and labor intersected with work, often forcing difficult decisions. Many women hid signs of their condition from clients, fearing mockery or loss of income. Others relied on silence and discretion, navigating the thin line between private life and public expectation. The brothel's walls provided no real privacy, but a careful routine, clever timing, and awareness of one's body allowed women to maintain some control. Hygiene extended beyond the body to clothing and bedding. Tunics and cloths were washed, dried, and reused. Bedding was shaken, straw replaced or brushed clean. Smells were masked with perfume, incense, or scented oils. Appearance mattered as much as cleanliness. A woman who looked well cared for attracted more clients, increased income, and reduced the likelihood of complaints or suspicion. Even during menstruation, some continued to work. Pain, cramps, and fatigue were managed through herbs, hot water, or distraction. The risk of infection or injury was ever present, yet earning coins often took precedence over comfort or health. The body became a tool and a battlefield, requiring vigilance, discipline, and sometimes endurance beyond human limits. Pregnancy brought visible changes that could not always be hidden. Women adapted by adjusting clothing, changing movements, and relying on sympathetic clients or madams. Some brothels allowed temporary lighter duties, while others demanded continued service. Social support, informal advice, and subtle navigation of risks were essential for survival.
public sanitation was primitive. Latrines were simple pits or stone seats, often shared by dozens. Water for washing came from fountains or carried from nearby wells. Women learned to combine necessity with discretion, cleaning themselves quickly, managing cloths or absorbents, and returning to work. Hygiene was strategic, entwined with survival, health, and dignity. Even at night when the brothel emptied, attention to cycles of life continued. Used cloths were cleaned or hidden. Baths, though rare, were cherished. Oils were reapplied to hair and skin. Preparations were made for the next day's clients, even if menstruating or recovering from pregnancy fatigue. The rhythm of care, work, and survival continued unbroken. Through these practices, Roman prostitutes demonstrated resilience and ingenuity. Their bodies, subject to cycles, risks, and social neglect, were carefully maintained. Hygiene was a weapon against disease, a shield against shame, and a tool to ensure survival in a society that tolerated their labor but despised their existence. In the shadows of the city, the reality of menstruation and pregnancy intersected with work, poverty, and survival. Toilets, bathrooms, and water were scarce, yet these women adapted with remarkable skill. Every cloth, every splash of water, every careful application of oil or powder was a testament to resourcefulness. Life continued despite these challenges. Each cycle, each month, each pregnancy was a negotiation with the body and the city alike. In the brothel, health and hygiene were not luxuries, they were essential strategies for endurance. Survival depended on them, as did the fragile dignity of a woman living in one of history's most complex urban landscapes. Even when invisible to the wider city, these women managed their cycles, their bodies, and their work. Their lives revealed the delicate interplay of biology, economy, and survival. Every day, every choice, and every precaution reflected a profound understanding of risk, resilience, and the human spirit.
Secrets behind the brothel walls. The city streets of Rome were bustling with merchants, soldiers, and citizens, unaware of the hidden worlds existing just above, below, and behind their eyes. Behind modest facades, narrow staircases, and heavy wooden doors, the brothels held secrets that were carefully guarded, navigated, and exploited by the women who lived and worked there. Every wall had a story, every corridor a purpose, and every locked door concealed not only pleasure, but power. Inside the brothel, the architecture was deceptively simple. Rooms were small, barely enough for a bed and a chest of possessions, yet hidden within these spaces were clever arrangements designed for survival and discretion. False walls, low ceilings, and tight corridors allowed women to escape threats or hide from particularly aggressive clients. A savvy woman knew every corner, every creak of a floorboard, and every shadow where she could momentarily vanish. Doors, too, were not merely functional. Some had hidden latches, allowing escape into a back corridor. Others concealed tiny compartments where coins, notes, or small valuables could be stored, safe from the reach of a careless or hostile visitor. These hidden compartments were often placed beneath loose stones, under mats, or within carved furniture. Every item had its place. Every corner served a purpose. The walls themselves were witnesses. Marks from previous tenants, scratches from desperate escapes, or faint graffiti told silent stories of danger, rebellion, and survival. Some rooms had small ventilation openings, thin enough to prevent intrusion but allowing airflow. In winter, they preserved warmth. In summer, they prevented suffocation. Every architectural choice reflected centuries of trial and error, the hard-earned knowledge of women who had learned to navigate a perilous world. Privacy, as modern audiences understand it, was scarce. Yet the brothel's secret spaces created microenvironments where women could momentarily reclaim control. A hidden alcove might serve as a place to rest, catch a breath, or exchange whispered information with a trusted colleague. A concealed stairway could lead to a quiet rooftop
where a woman might glimpse the sky for a few precious minutes. These spaces were carefully memorized, their existence often known only to those who needed them most. Safety was paramount. Aggressive clients, jealous rivals, or nosy neighbors could all threaten the fragile balance of survival. Women learned to use the architecture to their advantage, maneuvering through narrow passages, retreating into secret corners, or signaling allies through subtle knocks or gestures. Trust was a currency, and the physical space of the brothel was an extension of that trust. The corridors often served as communication channels. Women passed messages, whispered warnings, or shared advice about a difficult client without ever stepping into the same room. A single cough, a tap on a wall, or a shift of a mat could transmit critical information instantly. The layout of the brothel was not just functional, it was tactical. Each turn and partition was a line of defense, a way to maintain order in a chaotic environment. Even the furnishings played a role. Beds could be shifted to block doorways, curtains could hide movements, and chests could conceal more than belongings. Mirrors, while primarily for appearance, could also reflect sight lines, allowing a woman to watch a corridor or anticipate a client's approach without being seen herself. Every object became a tool, every placement a strategy for safety and control. Some brothels had multiple floors with tiny windows, too high or narrow to offer much view, but sufficient for ventilation and light. Roof access provided another layer of escape, a chance to observe the surrounding streets, or simply a private moment away from the constant demands of clients. Women who mastered the layout of their building could move through it almost invisibly, blending necessity with performance, safety with service. Secrets were also about social intelligence. Younger women learned the hidden routes, the safe rooms, and the signals from senior colleagues. Knowledge of the building equated to knowledge of survival. A single misstep, entering the wrong corridor, mistiming a meeting with a client, or misunderstanding a signal could be costly. Experience transformed the architecture into a protective ally. Each wall and passage became a silent partner in the daily battle of survival. Even routine tasks like cleaning or arranging belongings were performed with an awareness of these hidden spaces. A basin might be moved to obscure valuables, a chair shifted to conceal movement, a mat folded to hide a private note. Women adapted the physical environment to match their strategy, transforming ordinary domestic actions into acts of self-preservation. At night, the brothel transformed again. Candles and oil lamps flickered, casting long shadows that played tricks on the eyes. The hidden alcoves and secret passages became even more essential. Noise, light, and movement were carefully controlled. A woman could retreat, regroup, or rest safely while the building seemed empty to the casual observer. The brothel secrets, so vital by day, became guardians by night. Visitors rarely understood the complexity behind the walls they entered. They assumed a simple transaction, a straightforward encounter. Yet each knock on a door, each request, each gesture navigated by the women involved layers of awareness, knowledge, and strategy. The architecture was not merely a backdrop, it was a character in the daily drama of the brothel, silent yet indispensable. In the hidden corners, whispered alliances formed. Women shared warnings about dangerous clients, strategies for negotiation, and small comforts to sustain morale. The walls held these confidences, absorbing secrets, protecting them, and silently witnessing the endurance of those within. Every scratch, every mark, every hidden compartment told a story of resilience, cunning, and survival. By mastering the secrets of their environment, Roman prostitutes exercised a form of power rarely acknowledged. They transformed narrow rooms, hidden corridors, and shadowed alcoves into a theater of control, safety, and subtle influence. While the city above celebrated grandeur, temples, and laws, below, in the brothel, Life depended on knowledge, instinct, and the careful use of every hidden space. These walls were not just stone and wood. They were shields, maps, and allies. They allowed women to navigate danger, maintain dignity, and claim moments of privacy in a world that sought to deny them both. In understanding these secrets, one glimpses the ingenuity, resilience, and intelligence that defined their hidden lives, unseen but essential to the heartbeat of Rome.
Marriage, relationships, and life beyond the brothel. Life in a Roman brothel was demanding, dangerous, and often isolating, but it was not devoid of intimacy or longings for companionship. Beyond the flickering oil lamps, the echoing corridors, and the constant presence of clients, some women sought relationships, sometimes fleeting, sometimes enduring, that offered emotional refuge and a glimpse of normalcy. Marriage, though rare, was a possibility for a few, and even temporary liaisons could reshape a woman's life profoundly. Marriage in the context of a prostitute's life was complicated. Social norms in Rome often stigmatized women of the trade, and many men sought them for pleasure but avoided public acknowledgement. For a woman, choosing a husband involved weighing security, love, and the likelihood of acceptance in a society that judged her profession harshly. Some men were genuinely affectionate, offering protection, financial stability, or a chance at a life beyond the brothel. Others were opportunistic, exploiting the woman's labor or social vulnerability for their own advantage. The process of courtship was delicate. A woman might meet a client repeatedly, observing his temperament, generosity, and respect. Trust could take weeks, even months to establish. Letters, small gifts, and secret meetings helped forge connections that could evolve into deeper bonds. Yet every gesture carried risk. A wrong word, a public indiscretion, or jealousy from colleagues could shatter budding relationships. Pregnancy was often intertwined with love and social negotiations. Conceiving a child could bring joy, but also danger. If the father was a client or someone outside the brothel, paternity could be disputed, and the mother faced both societal scorn and practical challenges. Some men took responsibility, providing for the child and supporting the mother. Others vanished, leaving the woman to navigate childcare, finances, and survival alone. For those who married, domestic life was a constant negotiation. The brothel's walls, once a site of labor and performance, often continued to shape personal decisions. Many women remained in or near the brothel even after marriage, especially if income was essential. Marital partners might visit, provide additional income, or help manage risks, but the shadow of their former profession rarely vanished entirely. Friendships and alliances also played a crucial role in relationships. Experienced women guided the younger ones, advising them on which unions were safe, which partners were trustworthy, and how to navigate societal prejudice. Informal networks offered emotional support, childcare advice, and practical strategies for blending personal life with professional demands. These alliances were vital, for they often determined the success of a marriage or the well-being of a child. Daily life for married or partnered prostitutes demanded balance. They continued to maintain hygiene, appearance, and readiness for clients, even as they nurtured private relationships. Concealing menstruation, pregnancy, or fatigue was essential to maintain income and social discretion. Each day required careful scheduling, prioritizing tasks, and allocating moments of privacy within the crowded communal spaces of the brothel. Marriage could offer stability but not immunity. Conflicts, societal judgment, and the ever-present threat of illness or violence persisted. A spouse might be supportive, indifferent, or occasionally obstructive. Women learned to negotiate, sometimes subtly, sometimes boldly, to preserve both relationship and livelihood. Love and loyalty were exercised as strategic tools, as much as sources of comfort. Children born to women of the brothel faced unique challenges. Some were sent to live with relatives, others raised within the brothel under the supervision of trusted women. Education, nutrition, and safety were negotiated carefully, often requiring ingenuity.
Mothers balanced affection with vigilance, teaching resilience and practical skills to help their children survive and thrive in a world that offered little protection. Romantic relationships were also sometimes transactional. A partner might gain social or political influence through association, while the woman gained protection or financial security. These alliances were complex, blending desire, survival, and strategy. Intimacy was not always purely emotional. It was often intertwined with negotiation, mutual benefit, and long-term planning. Even amidst marriage or partnership, the emotional toll of brothel life persisted. Women maintained masks of composure and warmth, balancing personal feelings with the demands of clients and societal expectations. Nights spent with loved ones offered fleeting reprieve, but never complete escape. The boundaries between work, intimacy, and family life were porous, navigated with careful attention and instinct. The environment, once a stage for labor, became a private domain for emotional connection. Marriage or long-term partnerships did not erase the stigma of past work. Society, law, and even some clients remembered or discovered histories. Yet women demonstrated remarkable resilience. By blending prudence, discretion, and intelligence, they managed to forge meaningful relationships that provided support, protection, and occasionally a pathway to life beyond the brothel. In the shadows of Roman society, these women's relationships were acts of courage. Each bond, each marriage, each act of motherhood was a negotiation with circumstance, a statement of agency, and a testament to human adaptability. While their lives were never fully recognized or celebrated publicly, in the private realms of love, loyalty, and family, they exercised autonomy and shaped their destinies with determination and skill. Even as the city celebrated grandeur, conquest, and wealth, the intimate lives of these women bore witness to resilience, strategy, and quiet triumph. Love, marriage, and family were not guarantees of security, but they offered moments of solace, purpose, and hope, a reminder that even within the harshest environments, humanity persisted.
The secret language of the brothel. The brothel, for an outsider, might have seemed like a place of simple transactions and fleeting pleasures. Yet for the women who navigated its shadowed corridors, every gesture, every glance, and every subtle sound carried meaning. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with secrets, and the women spoke a language invisible to the untrained eye, a language of survival, caution, and solidarity. It began with the simplest movements. A tap on the wooden floor, faint yet deliberate, could signal the approach of a client who was unruly or drunk. A brush against a wall, barely noticeable, could warn a colleague that a rival was nearby. Even the placement of a piece of cloth on a bed or a turned cup on a table could convey instructions or alerts. Every action had a purpose, every pause a message. Knocks were perhaps the most crucial form of communication. They were not random, they were patterned. A single sharp knock might indicate danger, while a rapid triple knock could signal a friendly ally. Women memorized these codes early in their careers, passing knowledge down from senior colleagues to newcomers. Forgetting a knock or misinterpreting it could have consequences, sometimes minor, sometimes life-threatening. Gestures, too, were vital. A hand placed over the mouth could mean silence. A tilt of the head could indicate caution or approval. Even subtle shifts in posture were loaded with meaning. In a place where privacy was rare and danger was constant, these silent cues allowed women to maintain control over their environment, their work, and their bodies. Some signals were personal, tailored to relationships among colleagues. A wink, a nod, or the position of a comb on a table could convey private messages, warnings, or shared humor. These gestures created a private language, a bond between women who lived and worked together in close quarters. Trust was implicit.
Misreading a signal could betray vulnerability, expose secrets, or endanger lives. Sound played a complex role. The creak of a floorboard, the subtle dragging of a mat, or the quiet opening of a door could all function as coded alerts. Women learned to move in harmony with the building, using its natural acoustics to transmit messages without speaking aloud. Silence itself became a weapon. Knowing when not to speak, when to pause, and when to listen was as vital as any physical skill. Even the objects in the brothel were part of this secret language. A bowl left in a certain position, a chair turned at a particular angle, or a curtain drawn just so could signal an emergency, a client's temperament, or a safe hiding place. These signs were almost invisible to outsiders, but were instantly recognizable to those trained to read them. The complexity of this system extended beyond immediate danger. Women used it to coordinate schedules, warn of impending inspections, or subtly negotiate territorial boundaries within the brothel. Senior women acted as mentors, teaching newcomers how to read, interpret, and even create signals. Knowledge was a form of power. Mastery of the secret language meant safety, efficiency, and influence. Trust, of course, was fragile. Not all women were allies, and deception was a constant risk. Some gestures were deliberately misleading, used by rivals to create confusion or gain advantage. Detecting authenticity required intuition, observation, and experience. The brothel was as much a battlefield of subtlety and strategy as it was a workplace. Clients rarely understood this world. They assumed a woman's smile, a casual gesture, or a look was purely for seduction or service. They could not see the complex web of signals that ensured safety, managed conflicts, and maintained order. A wink might be for a colleague, not for them. A subtle shuffle might be a warning rather than an invitation. The untrained eye missed the invisible language that held the brothel together. This silent communication extended to emergencies. If a woman felt threatened, a series of knocks could summon backup from another room. If an inspector approached, a discreet signal could alert everyone to feign business as usual. If a client became violent, the placement of objects or the sound of movement could orchestrate a coordinated response. The brothel itself became a stage for a silent ballet, choreographed by necessity and survival instinct. Even the youngest girls learned quickly. Observation became second nature. They watched for micro-expressions, learned which knocks were safe, and which gestures indicated deceit or danger. Mistakes were costly, so attention to detail became a habit, ingrained into daily routines. Over time, the silent language of the brothel was as familiar and vital as breathing. In quieter moments, these signals were also a form of solidarity and care. A gentle tap on a shoulder, a secret glance, or a hidden note could convey reassurance, advice, or empathy. In a world of precarious existence, the invisible language allowed women to support one another, maintain morale, and cultivate trust. These small acts of communication were lifelines, sometimes more critical than money or physical protection. The secret language of the brothel was never static. It evolved constantly, adapting to new women, new clients, and changing conditions. A clever newcomer could add nuance or innovation, expanding the system for everyone's benefit. Those who mastered it gained not only safety, but also subtle influence, coordinating schedules, managing risks, and guiding others with silent authority. In essence, the brothel was a living organism, and the women were its communicators. Each tap, nod, and glance carried life-saving information. Every hidden gesture, every whispered rhythm was a testament to intelligence, adaptability, and resilience. In the shadows, behind the laughter and the doors, the secret language of the brothel told a story of survival, skill, and solidarity that no coin, no public record, and no outsider could ever fully capture. Even today, centuries later, one can imagine the quiet, deliberate movements, the hidden codes, and the invisible signals that allowed women to endure, protect, and support one another in one of history's most challenging workplaces. The brothel's secrets, spoken without words, remain a testament to human ingenuity, courage, and the power of silent communication.
The dark arts, love potions, charms, and aphrodisiacs. In the dim heart of ancient Rome, where marble streets glowed beneath the oil lamps and whispers floated through alleyways, another kind of trade thrived, one that was never officially recorded, yet endlessly sought after. It was the business of desire, and within it, the hidden craft of love potions, charms, and aphrodisiacs. The brothel women knew the art well. They had to. In a city obsessed with pleasure, beauty, and conquest, desire was both weapon and shield. A clever woman didn't just sell her body. She sold illusion, chemistry, and control. And sometimes that control came from a vial, an herb, or a whispered spell in the darkness. By the time dawn crept across the rooftops of Rome, the women were already mixing their magic. The air inside the brothel carried a strange fragrance, a mixture of wine, sweat, and crushed herbs. Dried petals of roses and violets lay beside small jars of honey, vinegar, and exotic oils imported from the East. On a tiny bronze table, bowls of powdered roots waited, ready to be stirred into secret brews that promised love, lust, or loyalty. Most of these ingredients weren't truly magical. They were products of desperate hope and observation. Yet, in a time when medicine and mysticism were one and the same, the line between belief and truth blurred easily. The women of Rome understood that better than any philosopher. One of the most famous aphrodisiacs was myrrh, a resin from Arabia, believed to warm the blood. Mixed with wine, it created a heady scent that lingered on the skin. Cinnamon, rare and expensive, was thought to awaken passion, while rocket seed, a humble plant still known today, was rumored to stir the loins. Even common herbs like mint or parsley were considered powerful when mixed with honey and whispered over at midnight. But for many women, the real power wasn't in the potion itself, it was in the performance. When a client entered, they might light a candle scented with crushed juniper, pretending it was enchanted. A flick of the wrist, a murmured word in a foreign tongue, and the illusion was complete. Rome's soldiers, merchants, and senators believed what they wanted to believe, that the woman before them held power over love, luck, and destiny. The trade of potions and charms wasn't just about seduction, it was about survival. A jealous rival could destroy your reputation. A violent client could end your life. So, the women learned to craft not only love spells, but protective charms. Small amulets carved with strange symbols hung beneath their clothes, brushing against their hearts. Some wore lead tablets etched with curses to ward off enemies or bind a lover's affection. Others trusted in whispered prayers to Venus or Isis, goddesses who ruled over love, fertility, and female power. There were darker ingredients too, ones whispered about but rarely seen. Blood mixed with wine, a strand of hair from a lover burned and stirred into oil, the ash of a used lamp wick believed to draw passion when rubbed on the lips.
Whether these things worked didn't matter as much as the belief behind them. Belief, after all, was the strongest magic of all. In the narrow streets outside, men traded gossip about the witch women of the Subura, the lower district where many brothels stood. Some said these women could make a man fall madly in love. Others claimed they could make him sick with longing or regret. Fear and fascination mingled, giving the prostitutes an invisible armor. For a society that pretended to scorn them, men still returned night after night, hoping for another taste of that forbidden enchantment. Among the women, knowledge of herbs and charms was passed down like inheritance. The older ones taught the younger which roots to boil, which oils to blend, which prayers to whisper. Sometimes they experimented, watching which mixtures made clients relaxed, excited, or dizzy with affection. They weren't just performers. They were early chemists, herbalists, and psychologists. One story tells of a woman named Lucilla, who worked near the Circus Maximus. She was neither young nor beautiful, but she was always booked. Her secret? A potion made from honey, pepper, and poppy seeds. She claimed it opened the heart. In truth, it was mild and harmless, but the ritual, the mystery, and her calm confidence made men believe they were under her spell. And belief, as always, made it real. The line between love and control was thin. Some women used potions not just to attract clients, but to keep dangerous men obedient. A little powder slipped into a cup of wine, a charm tied around a wrist, and a whisper in an ear became weapons as sharp as any blade. Others brewed remedies for fellow workers, mixtures to ease pain, stop pregnancies, or help with sleep. The brothel might have been a place of pleasure, but it was also a place of shared survival, of women looking out for one another through secret arts. Of course, not everyone approved. The Roman Senate had laws against magic and sorcery, though such laws were rarely enforced against the powerful. But for women of the streets, even a rumor of witchcraft could mean punishment, imprisonment, or worse. So they worked quietly, in whispers and shadows. The magic survived through gestures, recipes scratched onto scraps of papyrus, and memories carried from one generation to the next. As night fell, the rituals began again. Wine poured, candles lit, voices low. Somewhere in the back room, a woman stirred a bowl of honey and herbs, humming a tune older than Rome itself. Outside, laughter mixed with music and the sound of sandals on stone. And above it all, unseen but ever present, hung the invisible promise of love, manufactured, bottled, and sold by those who knew that even in the oldest profession in the world, hope was the most valuable currency. Because in the end, the dark arts weren't about magic at all. They were about control, over fear, over chaos, over men, and sometimes over destiny itself. And for the women of Rome's brothels, that illusion of power, however fleeting, was worth every whispered spell, every stolen herb, and every drop of wine mixed with dreams.
Love, rivalries, and betrayal. The emotional lives of Roman courtesans. In the candlelit haze of Rome's night, desire was a trade, but emotion was a risk. For the women who lived behind the heavy wooden doors of the brothels, love was both a weapon and a wound. They sold affection by the hour, yet sometimes, somewhere between laughter and exhaustion, feelings slipped through, uninvited, unstoppable, and dangerous. To outsiders, the women were actors. They could cry on command, whisper sweet nothings, and make a man believe he was the only one in the world. But inside, beneath the painted smiles and perfumed skin, emotions were far more complicated. Love was forbidden, but it still found ways to bloom, quietly, recklessly, and often tragically. Some fell in love with their clients, not the drunk soldiers or the gamblers who came to forget their debts, but with the few who treated them like human beings. A kind word, a small gift, a night spent talking instead of touching. These simple gestures could pierce through the armor they wore every day. But love in the brothel was a dangerous game. It blurred the line between business and vulnerability. One woman, whose name history has lost, but whose story survived in whispers, loved a man who promised to free her. He swore he'd buy her contract, take her away from the city, and give her a new life by the sea. She waited. She even refused other clients to prove her devotion. But weeks became months, and when he finally returned, it wasn't to take her home. It was for another night, another lie. She never smiled again after that. They said she continued her work, but her laughter, once the loudest in the house, became only a memory. Love in such places often turned to rivalry. The brothel was not only a place of pleasure, but of competition. Every woman fought for the best clients, the richest tips, and the rare promise of security. Friendships were fragile, alliances shifted with every coin. A compliment could mask jealousy, a smile could hide contempt. Yet even in rivalry, there was understanding. They were all fighting the same storm, survival. Sometimes they warned each other of dangerous men, shared food or medicine, or covered for one another when someone fell ill. Their world was harsh, but they learned compassion from the cracks in cruelty. Still, betrayal lurked everywhere. A whispered secret, a stolen client, a rumor spread in the dark. It didn't take much to destroy a woman's reputation. The madams, or brothel keepers, encouraged this division. It kept the women under control. A divided house is a quiet house, one was rumored to say. And so the brothel thrived on both desire and distrust. There were also the pretend lovers, men who wanted the illusion of romance. They'd bring roses, sing poems, and talk of fate and passion. But when the candle burned out, so did their affection. The women learned to play along, to act the part, because pretending to love often paid better than love itself. For some, love became an addiction. The rare moments of tenderness they experienced, even if bought, felt real enough to crave. They'd seek it again and again, trying to fill the emptiness left by years of being touched but never truly held. It was the cruelest paradox. The more they sold love, the less of it they had left for themselves. And yet, not all stories ended in heartbreak. There were rare, fragile moments of hope. A woman named Flavia, for instance, worked in a small brothel near the Forum. She was quiet, older, and known for her calm eyes. One client, a widowed baker, began visiting her every week, not for pleasure, but for company. They talked about the market, the weather, and the loneliness of the city. When he died, he left her enough money to buy her freedom. She never remarried, never returned to her old life, but every morning she left bread and honey outside the brothel door, a silent offering to the women still trapped inside. Betrayal didn't only come from clients or rivals. Sometimes it came from the city itself. Rome loved to use these women, yet despised them in daylight. They were tolerated but never respected, needed but never acknowledged. Men wrote poems about them, artists painted them, but in the eyes of the law, they were still infamous, people without honor or rights. Many brothel women developed a kind of emotional armor. They could charm, seduce, and comfort, yet remain detached, at least outwardly. But deep down, they still felt everything. They saw the faces of men who came to them for comfort after battles, after heartbreaks, after deaths. They carried other people's secrets like invisible scars, and sometimes, when the city grew quiet, they whispered those stories to one another, not as gossip, but as a way to remember that they were still human. The walls of the brothels heard everything: laughter, moans, arguments, tears. But if those walls could speak, they would tell of something deeper: the hunger to be seen, to be loved, even if only for a heartbeat. In ancient Rome, the currency of affection was complex.
For most, love was a transaction. For a few, it was a rebellion. To fall in love meant to risk everything, your income, your safety, your heart. Yet even knowing that, even for a moment, was to remember what it meant to be alive. As the oil lamps dimmed and the last client left, the women sat in silence. Some counted their coins, some wiped away their makeup, some just stared into the dying flame. Outside, the city roared with the noise of carriages and laughter. Inside, behind the curtain, hearts ached quietly for lost promises, for brief tenderness, for the illusion of something real in a world built on pretense. And when the morning came, they would rise again, paint their faces and wear their practiced smiles, because in Rome, even heartbreak was part of the performance. Love might have betrayed them, but survival never did.
The brothel as a school of life. Wisdom in the shadows. The candlelight trembles against the cracked walls, painting golden shapes over the faces of women who have seen too much and learned even more. In this underground world of Rome, where sweat and perfume mix with ambition and despair, the brothel was more than a workplace. For many, it was a classroom, a cruel, unspoken university of life. They didn't learn from scrolls or philosophers, but from survival. Every night brought new lessons about power, about lies, about how a single glance could decide a woman's fate. The women of the Lupanar knew how to read men better than any senator could read law. They could tell who would be kind, who would be cruel, and who would pretend to love them just long enough to forget his own emptiness. By daylight, they were forgotten, but at night they became Rome's mirror, reflecting the secret desires and fears of its people. A brothel was a stage, and every performance revealed another truth about the world outside its doors. They learned how to speak without words. A lifted eyebrow could mean pay first. A small smile could mean be gentle. A certain silence, that meant I have seen men like you before. Their lives were a constant dance between control and surrender, between pretending to care and learning not to. They understood something philosophers rarely did, that people reveal their true selves when they believe no one is watching. And inside those dimly lit rooms, where reputation melted and names didn't matter, Rome's most powerful men became fragile, frightened, human. One woman, they said, could remember the stories of every man who entered her room, not for gossip, but as proof that power was temporary. She had entertained senators, soldiers, poets, and thieves, and all of them had left behind the same scent of fear. She once told a younger girl, "Every man brings his empire with him, and every empire falls before morning." In the world above, Rome celebrated heroes and warriors. In the world below, wisdom belonged to the forgotten. These women knew the market better than the merchants, understood politics better than the plebeians. They learned how to negotiate their price, how to flatter without surrendering, and how to survive without being seen. They knew the rhythm of the city, the sound of footsteps after curfew, the distant roar of the arena, the muffled laughter of those who had the luxury to forget. Theirs was a life lived in whispers, yet they understood the loudest truths. Sometimes, when the nights were slow, they would gather around a small flame, sharing stories, not of love, that was a currency they could no longer afford, but of memory. One had escaped slavery, another had once sung in temples, a third had lost her family to the plague.
Each woman carried a story like a scar, not always visible, but always there. And yet, despite it all, they found ways to laugh, to mock the men who thought money could buy devotion, to sing softly, mocking the very songs the nobles danced to. They created their own rituals, small rebellions against the world that used them. One girl would always burn a drop of oil before her first client, whispering a silent prayer to Venus. "Let me leave this night alive, and with a little more gold than I started." Wisdom here was practical, sharp-edged, born from bruises and broken dreams. They learned how to measure danger by tone, how to spot the glint of violence in a man's eyes. They learned when to fake a smile, when to pretend exhaustion, when to lie about illness just to survive another day. But perhaps their greatest lesson was this: they learned to see Rome for what it truly was. The empire's marble beauty hid 1,000 rooms like theirs, small, dark, and filled with people who kept the city running while never being seen. Every coin that crossed a noble's hand had likely touched theirs first. Every whisper of scandal began with a man who had once sworn to be faithful. They understood that history would forget them, and yet, in a way, that gave them freedom. No expectations, no legacy to protect, just the raw, unfiltered truth of existence. And in that truth, there was a kind of wisdom the poets could never write. One night, as dawn crept through the cracks in the ceiling, an older woman turned to the youngest among them and said quietly, "You think this is shame? No. Shame is for those who pretend to be pure while hiding what they do in the dark. We, at least, live honestly." The girl didn't answer. She just nodded, staring at the trembling light of the oil lamp, realizing perhaps for the first time that she wasn't just trapped, she was learning. Not lessons of love or virtue, but of human nature, of the masks people wear and the truths they fear. Outside, Rome was awakening. The markets began to hum, the soldiers shouted, the baker lit his fires, and deep below, in the still air of the lupanar, the women of the night prepared for another day, wiser, quieter, and more aware of the empire's soul than anyone above them. Because, in the end, the brothel was more than a house of sin. It was Rome's hidden archive, a place where secrets were traded, masks were dropped, and the most ancient lesson of all was written, night after night. Power fades, beauty dies, but wisdom, even in the darkest corners, survives.
The illusion of love, hearts in the shadows of Rome. The sun never truly reached the women of Rome's underworld, but love did, sometimes, in its most dangerous form. It came not as roses or poetry, but as whispers, glances, and empty promises that smelled of wine and desperation. In the dim glow of an oil lamp, even the cruelest man could look tender, and even the hardest heart could start to dream. For these women, love was both poison and salvation. It was the thing that made them feel alive, and the thing that reminded them how easily life could hurt. Every brothel girl in Rome had a story. Some had once been wives, betrayed and sold by their husbands. Some had been slaves, bought not for labor, but for lust. And some, the rarest kind, had come willingly, chasing survival or a faint dream of freedom that never quite came true. But inside those narrow rooms, where walls were thin and emotions forbidden, love was a dangerous luxury.
You could not afford to fall for a man who came to rent your body. And yet sometimes the heart did not listen to the rules of trade. There were men who stayed longer than they paid for, men who talked instead of touched, men who brought fruit, perfume, or a piece of jewelry they swore meant something. And sometimes the women believed them, because hope, even false hope, was a form of escape. One woman, they said, fell for a young soldier. He was new to the city, naive, his armor still shining. He came to her every week, paid more than he needed to, and listened when she spoke. He told her about his mother, about home, about how he would one day buy her freedom, and she began to believe him. She started to smile before he even knocked. She saved coins, imagining a life by his side, a small shop maybe, away from the smell of sweat and oil. Then one morning, he didn't come, nor the next. By the third week she heard whispers, his legion marched east, and many didn't return. No one ever saw him again. But she kept his ring, hidden in a corner of her bed, as proof that for a brief moment she was not invisible. In Rome's brothels, love stories were like ashes, beautiful when they glowed, tragic when the fire died. Some women learned early to shut their hearts completely. They laughed at men's lies, took their money, and forgot their names. Those were the ones who survived longest. But even they sometimes would go quiet when the city bells rang for a wedding above ground, because love, real love, was not for them. Rome didn't allow it. A prostitute could never marry a citizen. Her body might be touched by senators, generals, and merchants, but her name could never be spoken in public with respect. She was pleasure, not promise. And yet behind every smirk there was a hidden ache, a longing to be seen not as a body, but as a person. Sometimes one of them would whisper to another, "Do you think any man has ever truly loved one of us?" And the other would shrug, maybe smile sadly, and say, "Only until morning." Still they found their own forms of love, not with men, but with each other. They shared food when one was sick. They combed each other's hair, fixed torn dresses, hid bruises. They became sisters, not by blood, but by survival. Their laughter, though rare, was genuine, and that in its own way was love, stronger than any false promise a man could offer. There was also the love they gave themselves in secret, small moments of tenderness when the night ended and the city grew quiet. A woman would sit by the lamp, rub perfume on her wrists, and look into her bronze mirror, not to admire beauty, but to remember she was still human, still breathing, still here. For a few, love returned in a strange way. Old clients would come back years later, older, weaker, humbled by life. They'd see the same woman, now aged by time and struggle, and for the first time look at her not as desire, but with regret. Some even apologized. And though the women rarely forgave them, they took a quiet satisfaction in knowing that for once they had power. Because that was what love really meant here, not romance, not forever. It was the power to be remembered, even by those who wanted to forget. The poets of Rome wrote about Venus, the goddess of love. But in truth, love lived more honestly in these shadowed rooms, raw, bruised, and fleeting. There was no marble, no music, no divine blessing. Just two souls trying for a heartbeat to feel something real in a city built on pretense. And when dawn arrived, washing away the night's illusions, the women wiped off their rouge, straightened their hair, and prepared for another day. Love had no place here. yet somehow it lingered in the air, like the scent of old perfume, impossible to fully erase. Because even in Rome's darkest corners, even in the lives the world refused to remember, the heart, foolish, fragile, relentless, still dared to beat.
The price of freedom, when the night ends. The night in Rome was never truly dark. Even in the narrowest alleys, where shadows gathered like secrets, there was always a flicker, a torch, a lamp, or the glow of someone still awake. For the women of the brothels, that flicker was a cruel reminder. Night never really ended. It only changed its face. You could say freedom was the dream they sold, piece by piece, without ever owning it themselves. Every woman had her own version of what freedom meant. For some, it was a tiny house outside the city, a garden maybe, a goat, the sound of wind instead of footsteps. For others, freedom meant something simpler, one night where no one touched them. But dreams cost money, and money never stayed. The truth was brutal. In Rome, freedom was not earned, it was bought, and the price was higher than any coin a man could offer. Many of the prostitutes were slaves. Their bodies were property, their earnings collected by an owner who lived far better than they ever could. Some were freed women, lucky enough to have bought their liberty, unlucky enough to realize that society still saw them as impure. Freedom didn't come with dignity, it came with scars and debts. At dawn, when the last client stumbled out and the city started to stir, these women began their other life, the quiet one, the one no man saw. They swept the floors, counted the coins, patched their clothes. They whispered to each other about escape, not the kind from chains, but from memory. There were stories whispered among them. Of one woman who saved enough to buy her own tavern. She worked until her hands bled, serving drinks to the same kind of men who once paid for her. And yet, in the corner of her tavern, she placed a single oil lamp, always burning, as if to remind herself that the night she escaped was the night she was reborn. But most never got that far. The system was designed to keep them where they were. The lino, or brothel keeper, kept careful track of debts, the cost of the room, the oil, the clothes, the food. A woman could earn all night, yet owe more in the morning. The balance never cleared, just like the smell of sweat never left the sheets. And yet, sometimes freedom appeared suddenly, not as a choice, but as an accident. A wealthy patron might take pity on one woman, buy her freedom, and set her up as his mistress. It sounded romantic, even noble, but it wasn't freedom. It was just a prettier cage, gilded with false affection. The only difference was the quality of the sheets. Still, there were those who defied it all. One night, a girl named Marcia, no one remembered her last name, vanished. She was young, clever, and quiet. She had been saving coins for months, hiding them inside the cracks of the wall behind her straw bed. The rumor was that she bribed a guard, disguised herself as a servant, and fled the city. Some said she reached Naples, others said she was caught and thrown into the river. But every woman in that brothel told her story differently, because they needed to believe she made it. They needed proof that the night could end. In a place where the law saw them as shadows, freedom became something spiritual. They carved it into their minds, not their hands. They dreamed of it in the small hours when the lamps burned low and silence finally returned. Freedom was no longer a destination. It was a feeling, a single breath between transactions, a heartbeat unowned by anyone else. And sometimes it came at the cost of life itself. There are tombstones in Rome, forgotten, cracked, nameless, where historians have found faint carvings, a name, a profession, a line that reads, "She lived as she wished." Maybe it was true, maybe it was wishful thinking,
but it was enough to make even the coldest stone feel warm for a moment. The irony of it all was that Rome, the city of conquest, glory, and empire, was built on the backs of those who never knew freedom. Soldiers fought for land, politicians fought for power, poets wrote about virtue, but in the underbelly of that same city, women fought simply to exist. They were the forgotten citizens of an empire that celebrated gods but ignored the goddesses among them. And yet, if you listen closely, Rome still remembers them. Not through statues or scrolls, but through the stories that refuse to die. The whispers of narrow alleys, the worn steps of the old bathhouses, the faint perfume that clings to ancient stone. Their lives are everywhere, invisible, but undeniable. Because freedom, in the end, wasn't about running away. It was about refusing to disappear. Every coin they earned, every smile they faked, every night they survived, it was rebellion. It was proof that even in a world that bought and sold their bodies, their spirits remained unclaimed. And when the night finally ended, when the oil lamps dimmed and the streets began to glow with dawn, they didn't just vanish. They became part of the city itself. In every sigh of wind that moves through the ruins, in every glint of bronze that catches the sun, you can still feel them. The ones who refused to break, the ones who dared to dream of freedom even when Rome told them not to, the ones who lived in the shadows but left behind a light strong enough to outlast an empire. Because the night always ends, but the women of Rome's brothels, they never truly faded. They became the silence between history's lines.
The forgotten gods, faith, superstition, and survival. Night in Roma had its own kind of religion, one that never made it into temples or scrolls. It lived in whispers, in hidden gestures, in the small offerings left beside a flickering oil lamp. For the women of the brothels, faith was not about salvation, it was about survival. When you lived your life beneath the marble world, under the feet of men who called themselves gods, you learned to make your own kind of divinity. The priests of Jupiter preached purity and sacrifice, but these women had already given too much of both. So they turned to smaller gods, the ones who didn't ask questions. The household spirits, the forgotten deities of thresholds and shadows, because for them, even a tiny scrap of luck was worth believing in. In every brothel room, there was always a corner that belonged to something unseen. Sometimes it was a shelf with a clay figurine, Venus, Fortuna, or just a nameless goddess someone had carved years ago. Sometimes it was a pebble from a river, wrapped in red thread, believed to protect against cruel customers. And sometimes it was nothing but a candle, burning for the souls of those who didn't survive the night before. Faith here wasn't gentle. It was desperate, fierce, and deeply personal. Before every shift, a woman might touch her lips and then her doorframe, a silent plea to whatever spirit lived there. Keep me safe. Let him be kind. That was prayer enough. The irony was that Rome itself was obsessed with the divine. Temples rose on every hill, sacrifices filled the air with smoke, and philosophers debated whether virtue came from the gods or the stars. But the women in the shadows of those temples, they had their own theology, written not in books, but in bruises and breath. They believed in signs. A cat crossing the doorway meant good luck. A coin dropped before payment meant misfortune. If the lamp flickered for no reason, it was said a ghost had entered the room, perhaps a sister who didn't make it home. There were nights when the brothels went silent all at once. Someone had died, sickness, violence, or simply exhaustion. And in those moments, the women would gather,
quietly in the back room. No priests, no hymns, just a bowl of oil, a few flower petals, and whispered prayers. Let her find peace somewhere better than here. To outsiders, it looked like superstition, but for them, it was the only way to stay human in a world that refused to see them as such. Venus was the goddess they called upon most often, not the polished divine Venus of noble villas, but the raw, weary Venus who understood their trade. They would trace her name in the dust, or hang small mirrors near their beds to honor her. They prayed not for love, but for mercy, that men's tempers stay calm, that business be steady, that the night pass without pain. Some even made their own charms, a bone carved with initials, a braid of hair tied around a coin, a seashell from the coast said to bring the blessing of Aphrodite herself. Tiny talismans of control in a life where control was rare. There were darker rituals, too. When jealousy, fear, or heartbreak consumed them, some turned to witchcraft, then officium, the secret art. They would mix herbs, ashes, and whispers, hoping to curse a cruel client or draw back a lost lover. Rome feared these women's magic. They called them dangerous, immoral. But in truth, it was the only power they had ever been allowed to wield. And maybe it worked, because now, 2,000 years later, their names are gone, but their stories still breathe, while the names of their judges and masters have turned to dust. Faith also lived in the small kindnesses between them. When one woman fell ill, others would light candles for her. When one was beaten, the others would stay awake, whispering prayers through the night. Venus, keep her heart strong. Fortuna, turn your wheel in her favor. It wasn't religion. It was rebellion disguised as devotion. Sometimes a soldier or merchant would ask mockingly, "Do you really think your little gods hear you?" And they'd smile, a tired, knowing smile, because they had already seen enough to believe in things the rich could never understand. When you live every night at the edge of life and death, you learn that belief is not a luxury, it's a weapon. Some said the gods favored the powerful, but the women of the brothels knew better. They believed the gods pitied the forgotten, that somewhere, beyond the marble heavens, a softer kind of divinity watched over them. And when the storms came, thunder cracking over the rooftops, lightning flashing against the temples, they would stand in the doorway and look up, unafraid, because in that brief moment, it didn't matter what Rome thought. It didn't matter that the priests ignored them, or that the law erased their names. For a heartbeat, they were part of something greater, a force that neither shame nor empire could destroy. When morning came, the candles would burn low, the oil would run out, and faith would once again shrink back into whispers. But it never died, because in the end, their gods were not carved from marble or gold. They were made of endurance, of defiance, of hope that refused to die. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most sacred kind of faith there ever was. When the lights went out, death and the afterlife of Rome's forgotten women. The night was quiet, too quiet. In the narrow stone rooms of Rome's brothels, silence usually meant one thing: someone was gone. No mourning bells, no processions, no carved marble names. Just a missing voice, a cold bed, and a faint scent of oil that lingered too long in the air. Death in ancient Rome came easily to those at the bottom. For soldiers, it was a badge of honor. For nobles, a ceremony. But for the women of the brothels, death was just the end of rent. When a prostitute died, no priest came to bless her. No one poured wine for her soul. The madam or brothel owner would simply have the body carried out, sometimes to the nearest pit, sometimes to the edge of the Tiber River. If she was lucky, another woman, a friend, a rival, maybe both, would slip a coin into her hand, not for wealth, but for Charon, the ferryman of the dead, because even the forgotten needed to cross the river. But the truth is, most of them didn't make it to any river. Their bodies were dumped into common graves, puticuli, vast pits where slaves, beggars, and prostitutes all ended up together. No tombstone, no name, just bones, piled with the city's trash, melting back into the dirt of Rome. It's cruel, isn't it? A city that built temples of marble couldn't spare a single stone for the women who helped fund its pleasures. Men who toasted to Bacchus at night couldn't remember the names of those they left bleeding by morning. And yet, in their own way, the women prepared for death more honestly than anyone else. They talked about it often, between customers, between meals. Death wasn't a tragedy, it was a fact. It hovered in the corner, listening, waiting its turn. Some women kept tiny charms to protect their souls, a bronze amulet, a piece of coral, a scrap of parchment with strange symbols. Others whispered to Venus before sleeping, "If I die tonight, don't let it be ugly." Because in Rome, a beautiful death was sometimes the only beauty you could afford. And then came the question no philosopher dared answer. Where did they go after death? The priests said impure souls wandered forever, cursed for their sins. But the women didn't buy that. They believed something gentler. They said Venus herself had a secret garden beneath the earth, a place where broken women rested in peace, far from judgment and noise. They called it Domus Hunae, or the House of the Moon. It was said that when a prostitute died, her spirit followed the moonlight out of the brothel's window, through the narrow streets, past the temples that had denied her, and down to the underworld where the goddess of love would greet her with open arms. No shame, no fear, just silence, and finally, peace. Sometimes when a friend died, the women would gather in secret after midnight. They'd light small candles, dip their fingers in oil, and draw a crescent moon on the wall, her path to the next world. Then they'd drink cheap wine, not to mourn, but to remember. Because if Rome wouldn't keep their names, they would. There was a quiet rebellion in that remembrance. Every time they spoke the dead woman's name aloud, every time they laughed about her jokes, or cursed the men who wronged her, they were keeping her alive in the only way they could. And somehow, that mattered more than any marble tomb. Archaeologists today have found those unmarked graves. They dig up bones with traces of jewelry, bits of perfume bottles, and bronze hairpins still tangled in curls of dirt. It's the closest thing to a ghost Rome ever left behind. Each bone tells a story of labor, of resilience, of nights that never ended. And if you listen closely, in the echo of the stones, in the cracks of the old lupanar walls, you can almost hear them still. The brothels themselves became tombs of memory. Long after the women were gone, the graffiti they left behind stayed. A carved heart, a name, a curse against a cruel client, or simply, "I lived." Those two words, scratched into plaster 2,000 years ago, defy every empire that tried to erase them. Even death, it seems, couldn't silence them. Because the women of Rome knew something the philosophers forgot. Immortality doesn't come from temples or statues. It comes from being remembered, from being whispered about, from someone, somewhere, still speaking your story aloud. And here we are, centuries later, still telling it. They may have died nameless, buried in the dirt beneath the marble, but they live in every word, in every echo, in every shadow of history that refuses to fade. So tonight, when you look up at the moon, remember this. For every queen carved in stone, there were 100 women who never got a name, but who kept Rome's heart beating in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, they're still watching. Not from Olympus, not from heaven, but from that quiet place where all forgotten souls finally rest, the house of the moon.
The last night in Rome, when the lights faded and the world moved on. The night was warm, and the air above Rome hummed with music and laughter. From the grand villas on the hills to the shadowed streets below, the city glowed like a dying ember, still bright, but burning out slowly. Inside a narrow alley, where the scent of wine mixed with dust and memory, stood one of the oldest brothels in the city. It had seen everything: love, power, betrayal, and despair. And tonight it would see its last sunrise. The women inside didn't know it yet. To them it was just another night, another string of footsteps climbing down the stairs, another handful of coins clinking on the table. But Rome was changing. The empire was growing tired. The soldiers who once brought gold now brought rumors of new gods, new morals, and a world where desire would be called sin. One woman, older now, her hair streaked with silver, sat by a bronze mirror. She had no name left, not one she could say aloud. Once men had whispered it like a prayer. Now even the walls had forgotten. She watched the tiny flame of her oil lamp tremble and smiled sadly. She had lived her whole life in this room, her youth, her pain, her survival, all wrapped into the scent of old perfume and smoke. Outside, the streets echoed with the sound of soldiers marching. The brothel keeper peeked through the shutters, nervous. A new law had been passed. The temples wanted purity. The city wanted order. No more public pleasure, no more open sin. Prostitution, the empire's oldest business, was to be erased, not with swords, but with silence. For centuries, these women had been part of Rome's pulse. They had seen emperors rise and fall. They had heard secrets no historian would ever record. They had been painted in the backgrounds of great murals, not as saints, but as shadows, faceless, timeless, essential. And now history was closing its door on them. The old woman stood, wrapping a faded cloth around her shoulders. Her reflection looked back at her, tired but undefeated. She thought of all the women who came before her, the girl who laughed too loudly, the one who danced even when the world mocked her, the one who dreamed of freedom. She thought of the men, too, lonely, lost, drunk, cruel, all of them pieces of the same broken city. Rome had built its empire on their backs and its beauty on their suffering. Outside, the moon climbed higher, spilling silver light through the cracks in the wall. The other women gathered near the door, whispering about what they'd heard, that soon soldiers would come to shut down the brothels. Some were afraid, some didn't care, because what could the world take from them that it hadn't already stolen? The old woman reached for her lamp,
the same one that had burned beside her for years. She turned the wick down slowly, the flame shrinking to a golden tear. Maybe this is how Rome forgets, quietly. But history never really forgets. It just buries. Centuries later, when archaeologists began to dig through the ruins of Pompeii and Rome, they found them again. The walls, the paintings, the graffiti. A woman's name carved beside a heart. A phrase scrawled in charcoal, "She made me laugh." Little fragments of forgotten lives, sealed in ash and silence. The bones they found were delicate, worn, sometimes buried with a bronze comb or a clay perfume jar. Small things, worthless in gold, priceless in truth. Each object whispered of a woman who lived not as a goddess, but as a survivor. And suddenly, history began to listen again. The scholars tried to describe them, meretrice, lupe, scorta, but those words were too small. They weren't just prostitutes. They were witnesses to desire, to decay, to what it meant to be human in the shadow of marble gods. Rome fell as all empires do. Its temples cracked, its leaders vanished, its armies turned to dust. But the memory of those women stayed, not in statues or scrolls, but in the whispers of the city itself, in the scent of oil that clings to ancient stones, in the faint laughter that archaeologists swear they hear when they walk the old streets at night. And maybe that's how they won. Because for every emperor who demanded to be remembered, there were 1,000 women who simply lived, without monuments, without mercy, and somehow outlasted them all. So when you walk through the ruins of Rome, look closely. See the small doorways half buried in the earth, the rooms barely wide enough for a bed. That's where they were. That's where history forgot to look. Maybe one sat by the window, watching the dawn rise over the forum. Maybe she smiled, not because she was free, but because she knew, even if the world erased her name, it could never erase her story. And here we are, 2,000 years later, still telling it, still hearing the echo of her footsteps in the marble halls of time, still feeling the warmth of her lamp burning softly against the darkness. Rome is gone. The empire sleeps beneath its own ruins. But the women who once lived in its shadows, they are still awake, still whispering, reminding us that history is not made only by the powerful, but by those who endure, unseen, and refuse to disappear. And as the last flame of the brothel's lamp flickers out, the city above continues to hum, unaware that one of its oldest stories has just ended, not with noise, but with peace.